Welcome to Tech Talent Unlocked. I'm Anthony Ginn, and this is a series of podcasts where we'll be speaking to thought leaders across a wide range of topics that are close to our hearts here at my organisation, IQUAD. Across the series, we'll be exploring tech skills, skills gap, culture, inclusion, social mobility, skills development, and diversity. But we're going to kick off series, or episode 2, I should say, with organisational culture and cultural change. This has obviously, been a very current theme across the last few years. And we've got a guest today in Saloni Sharma, who's got experience across technology, financial markets and telecoms. We're going to talk to her a little bit more about organisational culture and cultural change from when she was running a role within financial markets within a very intense period of heavy regulation and very solid mind frames of individuals. Saloni, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for being here. We're going to jump into the first question right now, which was, your journey into shaping culture and, from kind of within the conduct space through into the culture space. So I just want to kind of hand that over to you and start that question.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on this podcast. So yes, my journey started when I was in NatWest Markets, because I don't need to remind anybody how the culture in the financial markets brought down essentially the financial sector and the economy in many countries. And when the regulators and the lawyers started to look at what was the root cause, actually, it was down to culture and what we call conduct. And actually, sometimes people use conduct and culture interchangeably. And the way I think about culture is, how do people behave and operate when no one is looking? So if you knew that there are police cameras and there's average speed applies for camera, you stay within the limit. But when you know that there are no cameras and you can get away with it, you may choose to speed because your goal is to get somewhere quicker. If your goal is to get somewhere more safely, you may choose to actually follow the speed limits, be a bit more careful about your driving. But if your ultimate aim is, I need to get somewhere quicker, then you will disregard that speed limit. And actually, that's where conduct comes in, is what are the rules and boundaries that we put in place within our companies, within ourselves, to make sure that we are achieving the right outcome. Are we trying to get somewhere really quickly, or are we trying to get somewhere safely? And within banks, it seemed like people's incentives and rewards were more aligned to, we need lots of revenue. Year on year, people were measured on how much revenue they produced, not whether that revenue was sustainable over multiple years, or that revenue resulted in fines, or that revenue actually missold or mispriced products for our customers, and therefore not only impacted the customers, but our own shares and underlying share line, because individuals were not rewarded and incentivized with our bank's goals. They had their own separate goals and incentives.
Absolutely.
So that was for me the fundamental realization.
Yeah, so I was just going to jump in on there and just say, obviously, within financial services, with the size of the organization that you're working at, the amount of employees, the regulation that's probably involved as well. It's a very complex piece to be able to sew together into an all-singing hymn sheet. And I just wondered if you could kind of talk a little bit more to the guys that are listening, so we could try and give some, direct information across. How did you make this possible? Where was the building blocks? How did you start? I mean, I imagine, you said that there was probably some, kind of pieces that weren't aligned to the way that things wanted to be going forward. So how did you start this rebuilding process in terms of starting this cultural change?
Yeah, so essentially, and it's something I've used since then, is thinking about the framework and the structure of things and rules we need to put in place.
Yeah.
And separately, what's the mindset shift required of individuals? So in my current company, we refer to it as wiring and mindset. So wiring is about, okay, what are the rules that people must absolutely adhere to? And we're going to put layers of checking on those rules to make sure people are following those rules. And that's typically through policies and reducing the amount of risk people can take. So really dialing down on level of market and credit risk that people can take. Therefore, actually saying, right, where you had this much leeway, you could do things you could be empowered, you could do things yourself. We're going to tighten it right down. Okay. And then that makes it easier for us to check your work. Okay. And the way we implemented that was something all industries use, which is the 3 lines of defense model, where ultimately your third line of defense is your internal audit, who should be doing some very high, they do deep down, but they can't cover everything. And then you have second line of defense. These are the people who are setting the policies and the rules, the really tight rules, to make sure people are setting those rules. But the fundamental shift was a lot of focus on first line of defense and saying that you individual salespeople, traders, you need to implement the right controls and checks and balances and supervisory oversight to make sure your people are not veering outside this zone. Because if they do, you're all going to jail. So, you know, and actually people, you know, in the financial sector, as you know, some people did get imprisoned for some of these things. Absolutely. And FCA made it clear, the Financial Conduct Authority regulator, that if they find misconduct in NatWest markets, then the accountability will go to the top. They said, we're not interested in, yes, of course, we want to make sure that people who are actually doing the day-to-day know what they're doing and know what the rules are. But if they get it wrong, it's your fault up here, senior management. So you're accountable. So they shifted the accountability. What that did was a shift in mindset. Now people felt, oh, I have personal accountability in this stuff. So they started looking at these rules and making sure their people were obeying these rules. So we deemed that culture of compliance, which was very much here are the rules, you must operate within these rules, and we will provide layers of oversight to make sure you're doing it. It worked in terms of building the trust back with our regulators, building the trust back with our customers. So that was a good thing.
It sounds very intense. Sounds very prescriptive and very intense for not only yourselves trying to execute that, but potentially for the employees as well, trying to ensure that they're not kind of treading on glass as such and breaking these new rules as well, which I think we all know a lot about new rules over the last 18 months as well, which many people have struggled to keep up with. So how did that kind of go through? You know, I mean, obviously at first, and there's the intensity of the regulator behind it, which is, you know, always a kind of strong rationale to really hammer home to the employees. Was there a chance of kind of loosening that message slightly to try and get it across rather than being so prescriptive as such?
So that one of the things that we realized actually was what the culture of compliance was creating was a culture of fear.
Okay.
People were afraid to make any decisions now, to the point where taking on any new risk on a new client transaction, which even slightly encroached outside, it was no, I'm not doing it. And what you found was that it impacted our customer service and impacted the business, because suddenly we've lost innovation. We've lost that creativity. We've lost that motivation of our people, the engagement of our people, especially the talented, the ones who are, you know, the smart ones who can help structure different ideas, different deals to suit our different customers. And we just kept saying no, because we were living within this channel. So actually what we saw was, whilst our regulators were starting to trust us, we had no business. Sure. You couldn't, so the business could not, it was not a sustainable business to stay within these rails. And that, again, was a mindset shift for some of our second and third line of defense people to understand that actually for a thriving business, we do need to start to take a bit more risk.
Yeah.
And so the focus then for senior management, the tone from the top, which is the most important thing in changing culture, was actually making sure that people get that tone from the top, but also incentivized, as I was mentioning earlier, incentivized for the right outcomes. So NatWest Markets and NatWest as a whole actually looked at its whole total comp, how it pays total comp and how it awards bonus. Completely changed that. A lot of banks did. They started to look at longer term deferrals and aligning those to the share price and not just to individual years revenue, because revenue, you go up in 1 year, you get a huge bonus, goes down the next year, you get no bonus, but that's because of some decisions you may have made in the previous year. So a lot of senior management all had their compensation and their salary and their bonuses more aligned to customer outcomes and the share outcomes. So really, really making sure, and employee engagement. So three things that are really important in a company is its long-term viability, which is through the share price, its customer outcomes, which is through how much customer churn and attrition you get, market share, etc. And the third is employee engagement. If your employee engagement is low, then you're not going to attract talent. You're not going to be able to retain talent. And by the way, who's going to come and work for a company that has a poor reputation?
Yeah, of course.
So the management that tackled those three things, it wasn't just about loosening the rules a little bit. It was tackling those outcomes before we could then start to loosen the rules.
Absolutely. And if we look at, we talk about cultural change, and many people will be listening to this and they may not be within financial services as such, or financial markets specifically as well, but actually it was a very hard-nosed environment. So actually a great one to talk about and very relevant to anyone's sector, because it's such a changing stance. It went over such a short period of time. And I just wanted to kind of ask, obviously you mentioned some of the building blocks that you've put in play. Was it something that the kind of the top brass and the top executives kind of jumped on board with immediately? You're saying the tone from the top is so important. Is this something that evolved, or was this something that really kind of took hold of by the senior management and helped you push that message, or was you gently helping them push it as well? Was it a kind of discussion both ways?
Yeah, it was a combination of both, to be honest. Okay. In that the challenge for any business is that sadly some of the analysts who are looking at our share price do look at year-on-year revenue, not just the sustainability. So there's always this big pressure of showing quarter on quarter that we have a healthy pipeline, that we have enough business to make it viable. So there's that balance, that commercial short-term balance with some of the stuff we're talking about here, the long term. So depending on the nature of the business, some of the executives probably took it on board quicker than others. And I think partly that was also in the FCA, we used to talk, the FCA used to talk about tone from the middle. So we have tone from the top, which is very clear. The executives were really on message. And of course, they were definitely incentivized and rewarded for long-term viability. Yeah. But the challenge was that middle management. And so the tone from the middle is where we realized we struggled the most, because in that middle are some of the people who they're not trying to do bad things in a misconduct or fraudulent aspect, but it's the way they've always done things. Yeah. And so it was really hard to move them in some of these cases, and FCA referred to them as permafrost. These are people who are really tough to melt and mold into the new way of thinking. Yeah. And in those senses, we struggled. We struggled in two ways. We struggled because some of them were also some of the talent, the talent in terms of very smart, bringing in good revenue, but they were also the ones who were not necessarily on message with the new culture. And I actually remember having a conversation with the CEO of NatWest Markets at the time, and I said, you need to make a decision here. This is your moment of, are you going to allow this behavior because then you're sending a message, or are you going to sacrifice some short-term revenue to really show that you want to reform the company? And good on him. He took the right decision, and how shall we say it, helped them find other careers elsewhere.
Sure. Well, absolutely. So that was actually going to lead me on to the second point. I'm just writing some notes here, and it seems a very fine balance. When you're trying to make such a big change, and you're turning an oil tanker, really is what you're trying to do with an organization, so heavily regulated, but also so probably correctly poorly regulated for so many years prior as well. There's a lot of change in a short space of time. And on the cultural piece, but trying to get that moved across, and you mentioned obviously at the beginning of the podcast that it became very prescriptive, very narrow. It also led to actually a culture of fear. And I imagine that this obviously went across some of these mid-level guys as well. And I just wanted to try and understand, some of the techniques, processes, or how that message was kind of maybe adapted, changed to try and bring these people into play. And I think, as quite rightly, as you just mentioned at the end there, I suppose if people aren't willing to make that change, then maybe a change of direction is required, which is also actually a very important message within cultural change as such, if you're genuinely on that ship in the new direction. So I just wondered about those mid-level guys, etc., and how you kind of got that change maybe it was a change of tone to start ensuring that they were part of this kind of new way.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of ways of doing that. One was they used to have to every day go into a system and say, yep, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've checked this, I've checked this. It was a supervisory checklist.
Right. Okay.
And so what we did was that was the first step, was we took that away. We said, right, we think you're adult enough now to not be checking. We trust you enough. However, we will trust and verify, which means at any point we could come in and do some spot checks to make sure that you have still been doing the oversight of your people.
Sure.
So you're not going into a system to tick boxes to tell us you've done it. We're going to assume you've done it. But when we come as second line of defense or third line of defense, when we do our internal audit or any assurance, we're going to check this stuff. And we're going to look back over the past 3 months or whatever, however long we want to. And if we find you haven't been doing it on a regular basis, obviously exceptions are fine, but if you haven't been, then you will be held to account for that. And at the same time, we then gave them, particularly in financial markets, in sales and trading, you get extra risk limits. So we'd really tighten those risk limits so they couldn't breathe almost. They couldn't really flourish. They couldn't really do more business because they couldn't take on more risk. So we then gradually, in a controlled way, on a quarter by quarter, gave them a bit more risk, because the regulators got comfortable with, we had to go to the regulator to allow us to give people a bit more risk. So we gave them room to breathe, if you like. And by having that room to breathe, they could now compete in the market with their peers, because a lot of American banks, by the way, didn't go tight like in the same way as particularly UK banks. European banks did, but UK ones really, the regulators really clamped down. And so there was also a recognition that UK banks were being penalized in some way, because maybe the regulators realized that now that we had realigned the bonus and incentive schemes, we had, put all these other things in place, it was time to, allow us a little bit more space, to allow us to innovate more products for our customers. That's what we were finding, was we'd lost that edge, we'd lost that innovation capability, which again would go against the UK kind of financial sector. And so it was a gradual thing, though. It was, years. We're not talking weeks and months, we're talking years. That's how it works.
And it was rebuilt. It feels like it was kind of, rebuilding that trust element, and that trust element to show that you're on the right kind of new roadmap as such, and that the employees are aligned to it, and almost as a kind of proof is in the pudding as such. But once you're kind of shown that, you're able to then kind of give back to the employees some more, flexibility in a way, right? Is for them to be able to execute their role, as you mentioned, potentially offer other services as such as well, for them to be able to flourish in their role. Because absolutely, as you mentioned, it did feel intense, in terms of that kind of initial sharp shift, because many people going through, organizational cultural change programs of work, they'll be able to do that in a much longer period of time. But obviously, through the requirements of regulation, it certainly advanced that. And I suppose there's two things, and I just wanted to, I think you've already kind of jumped on one of them, but, obviously working with very kind of powerful, successful, high performing individuals within the city of environment, within the financial markets, just trying to understand how that message kind of came across to them. And was this something that you just had to tie back and get that tied back to their commercial goals, have any chance? Because I imagine, trying to get them to understand in a different manner is probably even more painful.
Yeah, so again, there were two things. So one, yes, absolutely link the commercial outcomes. That was non-negotiable. But the other thing was, why should they stay in NatWest Markets? What is the new USP for NatWest Markets? And one of the things we did was we invested in technology. We invested in some new innovative technology that meant that these people were now involved in something new and different, and not the old type of financial products. So we went into more algorithmic trading. We went into a lot more of automation, a level of machine learning, which meant that some of the administrative side of sales and trading would be taken away from them, so they could focus on some of the real value add, the almost bleeding edge of products, where you really got to think of how you can corner the market, what makes our products more attractive to customers. So again, for some people, that became a massive hook to stay, because they were going to be part of something new, part of something different. And so, again, we were able to do that and allowed to do that once we had built the trust from the regulator. So, it had to be a step-by-step evolution. And so that was a big positive for being able to retain our talent and actually attract a number of new graduates who chose to come to us still. So we didn't see a decline in terms of graduates applying any more than other financial services, because at that time the Googles and the Amazons started taking graduates at a massive scale, but not now. Market, this is another one.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. So you're using technology ultimately as an instrument to empower your product, your people, your services, push forward the business, but ultimately as well through automation, optimize. You can imagine within any large organization, but that optimization piece is almost like a revenue service in itself, when you get that right. So that's brilliant, bringing that in to be able to empower them. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the pieces from your experience as well. And you've obviously been through an intense time when I imagine this was kicking off. I imagine this was, quite a lot of pressure, to say the least, working with many thousands of employees to get them quickly onto the new roadmap. And I wanted to kind of just check with you and see what were the pieces that gave you most satisfaction. You know, what pieces did you enjoy doing through this cultural process? And did you actually, you know, a second part of that question is, you know, once you kind of come to the latter part of this, did you genuinely, as you walk the floor, did you genuinely feel a cultural shift? You know, did you see that within the kind of the organization? Sorry, that was a very long question, but
That's okay. That's okay. I'll give it a bash. So I did an engineering degree, and so I have a little bit of an analytical, logical brain where I have to break everything down into a structure. And when I was first asked to look at culture, I really struggled to articulate it in something that wasn't fluffy and woolly and felt HR people like. And so actually that was hard. It was really hard. Lots of conversations with lots of different people, lots of reading, research on how do I shape the culture we want to how that translates into managing day-to-day conduct risk. Because ultimately that's what it is. The culture that we have manages the conduct risk. And it took a while for me to make that connection in my brain for a start. But once I did, so what I was really, really happy about was I was able to turn this concept, this idea into real defined actions and metrics of how we would go about measuring whether we've achieved the right culture. And by the way, the right culture is we were in reactive mode. Reactive mode was as soon as something blew up or went wrong, we'd go run around and fix it. Where's the fire? Where you want to get to, the next stage is proactive, where you're thinking a little bit ahead and planning a little bit ahead. But ultimately, where you want to get to is generative, which is risk and decisions are all just naturally built into your day-to-day processes and your mindset. So you don't even have to think about it. So it's automatically in your mind is in the right place. Most companies don't quite get to generative. They're somewhere between proactive and generative. And that's where NatWest Markets ended up with. So I was really immensely satisfied that we went from the low end of reactive to, you know, getting close to generative. And I could see that because one, the number of just respectful conversations you heard on the floor, there was less screaming and less, and by screaming, I mean people shouting across each other or over each other. And in some cases, yes, being disrespectful to each other. So day to day, it became visible to me in just the way how people spoke to one another, the respect that came onto the floor. Also, the other thing I noticed was suddenly people were talking about not revenue, but customer. What customer value have we added? And it was all about customer. How many customer transactions have we done? How much? What is our customer satisfaction, which was measured through a number of surveys and reviews and everything, and where do we rank against our peers? So suddenly we went from what's our revenue, or revenue cost to a customer-centric kind of dashboard and metrics. So for me, those two were real key kind of signals that we had moved, and we still haven't finished, but it was a good move to the right place.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And I certainly love that piece as well about that. Finally, you're seeing some workplace harmony rather than a shouting match at best as well. So yeah, I think that's great. So listening to some of the pieces that you've done, and it's really interesting to hear the fact that, you know, when you took on this role and the roles that you'd had before, you had to kind of retrain yourself and have some kind of time for self-reflection to be able to really start to get your thought process going in terms of the cultural change and the programs and these large programs that you put in place. I was just wondering how things may have adapted, how some of those hardened skills that you've learned over that time, maybe have gone into, you've taken with you into your next large role that you're doing at the moment. And, you know, is that something that you do regularly, that kind of self-reflection to ensure that you're constantly looking at the right angles? Be great to hear kind of how you manage that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm currently at another large UK company, and therefore you can imagine, whilst it has standard processes, it can always do better risk management. It can be more efficient in the way quality decisions are made, and how we approach risk in terms of when to take the right risks, when to dial down the risks, something we call risk appetite. And so a lot of the wiring things that I mentioned from my previous company, I have easily been able to translate into this company, because there are some very similar ways of managing risk in companies like these. And of course, again, the mindset piece as well. It's been really useful for me to bring the learnings from NatWest Markets into this company, so that people can learn about mindset from me. And lastly, the challenge for me was understanding the business model of this company around the sector that it is. It's a very different sector with different customers, but realizing actually my skills are equally adaptable regardless of the sector.
So you're proving the point that we mentioned throughout the podcast, which is, you know, ultimately, you know, you can move this from sector to sector to still be able to make that journey of cultural change, and bringing individuals, hopefully, round onto a new path that's kind of being led from the top.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. That's great. And it's that journey that you were saying, you know, and that journey kind of going from having the individuals and in these cases that you mentioned in the organizations that you've worked for, you know, taking individuals who've been either kind of acting, let's just say loose at best, to moving them to being prescriptive, but then actually getting them to ultimately be guardians of their organization, you know, which is really what it's about. You know, it's about trying to deliver that message to people. So it's almost subconscious. It's just part of their thoughts, you know, part of their decision-making processes. So ultimately, you don't have to be prescriptive about it. You don't have to drive it to them. And that's something, you know, as you've mentioned, takes time. It takes commitment, and it certainly takes a lot of metrics to prove that it's happening and it's going in the right direction. Well, look, thank you very, very much for your time today. There's many pieces across that, you know, certainly are going to be really interesting for individuals and managers and people that are listening to the podcast across that kind of process, and certainly give them food for thought. Just to have a quick shout as well for another podcast series which does an in-depth series within culture and cultural change, which is called the Culture Club, led by a guy called Brad Miller. That's definitely one to listen out for as well, should you want to hear all things more about cultural change. Saloni, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time, and certainly look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thanks a lot, Anthony.
Thank you very much.